When I arrived from New France by canoe, it was called La Baie. We French explorers added the word vert because of the greenish color of the waters. I was the first European to lay eyes on the magnificent wilderness, where the city stands today. La Baie Verte. Why did I come? We were looking for a route to China, a northwest passage. The forests overflowed with fur-bearing animals and game. I stayed that entire winter with the friendly Ho-Chunk, exploring the area to the south and west. When I left in the spring of 1635, I had not found the Northwest Passage. But I could hardly wait to tell my people of the wonderful place called La Baie.
Unfortunately, hostilities among the natives kept Nicolet's people out of La Baie until I came 30 years later. Sent by the French government to unite the Western tribes as our allies, I was the first European to live, albeit temporarily, in what is now Green Bay. Father Claude Alloway came 5 years later and built the mission of St. Francis Xavier at the De Pere Rapids on the Fox River. It became my headquarters and the region's center of commerce for nearly 20 years. Then angry natives burned the mission, and after my recall to New France 2 years later, wars closed the area to outsiders for another 75 years.
There were wars between the natives, wars between the natives and the French, between the British and the French and the natives and the British. I came to La Baie to make my home after the British had defeated the French and forced the tribes to move westward. At age 35, I'd been in the fur business and war business, and it was time to turn my attention to permanence and family. In doing that, I developed the area's first European community. I staked out land all the way down the bank of the river and parceled out plots to family and employees. For the next 50 years, our little Canadian outpost thrived in the fur trading business. We made up our rules as needed and enforced them with our own strength, without regard for British authority. Then after the Revolutionary War, which meant little to us, and the War of 1812, the Yankees came.
On a warm July day in 1816, the United States flag was raised over the ruins of Fort St. Francis. A new fort, named for U.S. General Benjamin Howard, was soon built on the spot, and La Baie was under the control of the American government for the first time. I arrived 8 years later at age 14, the bride of Wisconsin's first practicing attorney. I went on to become the cornerstone of area society. My husband, a dedicated barrister and future mayor, was instrumental in the shaping of Wisconsin and Green Bay. With barely 100 buildings making up the community in the early days, our circle was small. It included Daniel Whitney, the father of Green Bay, and his wife Emmeline, a dear friend we called the Queen of Navarino. Our neighbor, John Arndt, invented the Durham boat, which revolutionized river transportation in Wisconsin. Morgan L. Martin introduced the Wisconsin Statehood Act in Congress. The Reverend Otto Tonk of the Moravian Church was a very successful industrialist who left most of his land on the west side to the city. One of our number, Eleazar Williams, an Episcopal missionary, had come to the area in 1822, leading a contingent of the Oneida tribe of New York in relocating to a spot ceded to them by the Menominees.
On the day the United States finally declared Wisconsin a separate territory, I was one of the principal celebrants. One enterprise involved helping this rich Easterner run LeBay's most prominent French-Canadian fur traders out of business. His company forced them into foreclosure on their land, and, with my help, he turned the properties into a town we named in his honor. Astor became the third village in the community, along with De Pere to the south, and one to the north called Navarino.
When I laid out Navarino between the mouths of the Devil River and the Fox River in the fall of 1829, people thought I was crazy. It was all swampland, they said. But I knew it was also the gateway to Wisconsin. I built a dock, a warehouse, and a hotel. And while the fur business slowed to a trickle, the influx of immigrants looking for opportunities didn't. Soon we had a post office, a land office, then a newspaper. And in 1838, we merged Navarino with Astor to become the borough of Green Bay. 16 years later, on February 27, 1854, our community was chartered as the first city in northeast Wisconsin. At that time, Wisconsin had been a state for nearly 6 years. Fort Howard, the military post, was deserted. Joel Fisk's town of Howard occupied the land across the Fox River from Green Bay and De Pere. And a sound in the woods was growing louder.
For the nation's expanding lumber industry, northeast Wisconsin was a gold mine. Logging camps and mill towns sprang up all around, sending lumber and shingles by cart to our city. But even though we had a half dozen sawmills, Green Bay's role in the lumber industry was transportation. Goods and raw materials were shipped from here, first by water, later by rail, to distribution centers throughout the region. Throughout the decade, German, Irish, Dutch, Danish, and Belgian immigrants fled the poverty of their homelands for life in Green Bay. They came to work the land cleared by lumberjacks, or in the city's machine shops, foundries, sawmills, and boat shops. Some started stores and businesses of their own, capitalizing on skills they'd brought with them. Although hundreds of men, including my 56-year-old father, marched off to fight for the Union, the Civil War actually accelerated Green Bay's growth. The conflict created even greater demand for food and building materials from the area. And when it ended, the core of today's city took shape.
We'd been in competition with our neighbor across the river, Howard, since 1835. It was the arrival of the railroad in 1862 that created the need for a bridge across the Fox River. When that first bridge crossed the river at Walnut Street in 1863, the convenience of walking or riding between the towns didn't lessen our rivalry any, but it was the first step toward eventual consolidation. In the meantime, Green Bay housed the professional services, the doctors, lawyers, banks. In Fort Howard, they were home to the mills, foundries, and manufacturers. But most of the saloons were in Green Bay. Saloons were a necessity in 1866. Lusty lumberjacks were everywhere. So were merchants, attorneys, doctors, and shippers. Northeastern Wisconsin was thriving on the lumber industry that would spearhead the region's economy for the next 40 years. Sounds of hammers and saws erecting warehouses, offices, hotels, restaurants, schools, churches, and yes, saloons filled the air day and night.
As more and more work became available, more and more European immigrants arrived here to do it. There was work for a few years in the smelting industry, born of Upper Michigan's iron fields and the availability of scrub timber for fuel. 2 new breweries opened in 1866, bringing the area total to 6. The Blesch plant in Fort Howard was the first in northeast Wisconsin. and Hagemeisters eventually became one of the state's largest with their beer that made Milwaukee jealous. As trees disappeared, the land was turned to fields and pastures. Farming around Green Bay grew from a subsistence life to a major industry. For a time, Wisconsin was the nation's second leading grain producer, and by the turn of the century, Green Bay was an established cheese center. In 1875, Green Bay and Fort Howard had a combined population of 10,000, and there were 100 saloons, one for every 100 people. Law and order were hard to enforce in those years. For the first time, officials from the two municipalities began talk of combining their resources for better police and fire departments and other public services. Then, after the Green Bay people changed their terminology from annexation to consolidation, a spring referendum was held to settle the matter. On April 2nd of that year, we became one city. As the mayor of Fort Howard, I was honored to become the first person to hold that office for the new consolidated Green Bay. We welcomed a man named Hoberg and his new factory to our community a few months after consolidation. We weren't sure just what a paper mill did exactly, but needed all the new enterprises we could find to replace lumber revenue. Unfortunately, John never saw the impact his industry was to have on our economy. He was accidentally killed in his own shop in 1904, the year of Green Bay's 50th birthday. It had been a marvelous 50 years for the city, and that was just the beginning.